My name is Frank. I'm an alcoholic.
Hi, Frank.
Can you all hear? Yeah. You're a good-looking crowd, looking around, you know, kind of people I would have liked to have had a drink or two with each of you. You know, kind of loosen me up here. By the way, I see there must be nobody at my home group, which meets on a Friday night, West Side Step. I see almost all the faces here. I knew I was going to like it when I saw the size of the coffee cups. And they're not styrofoam for those of us who are ecology-minded. I'd like to start off with reading the preamble. Alcoholics Anonymous is a fellowship of men and women who share their experience, strength, and hope with each other, that they may solve their common problem and help others to recover from alcoholism. There's more. The only requirement for membership is a desire to stop drinking. There are no dues or fees for AA membership. We are self-supporting through our own contributions. AA is not allied with any sect, denomination, politics, organization, or institution. It does not wish to engage in any controversy. Neither endorses nor opposes any causes. Our primary purpose is to stay sober and help other alcoholics to achieve sobriety. And I feel a nice presence in the room. It really is. I did a lot of running around on this campus in the 50s, I'm ashamed to admit. And it's a little different now, I think. I think there are more buildings, certainly, or seems to be. And but just as hard to find. I remember having trouble finding it in the 50s, drunk. And it's just as hard to find sober. Let me just thank the committee for including me on this program. I feel very honored, deeply honored, honestly, to be on a program with Joe and Charlie and my friend Travis from Bristol. By the way, Joe engaged me in conversation in an effort to calm me down a little. I think he felt my intense nervousness. I don't know why that always is. I'm really super cool until about a half hour before, and the hysteria mounts. You know, and I think, oh God, I'm not going to say anything or I'll look like the fool I am, you know, that kind of stuff. But anyway, I appreciate your efforts. A word about history and why I think it's important that we think a little bit about that from time to time. Carl Sandburg wrote, "Whenever a society or civilization perishes, there is always one condition present. They forgot where they came from." I think that's true for us personally. I know it is for me. If I ever forget where I came from, I'm in big trouble. You know, I'm coming from acute alcoholism, end of the line alcoholism, somebody who is literally dead. In all measurable ways, probably, except physically. I somehow kept breathing when I didn't want to breathe. And I ended up in those chairs. And it's necessary that I remind myself from time to time by telling my own story, so I remember that I don't forget that sense of the moment when I entered AA, that moment when everything was possible. Everything changed around. The first 90 days in AA, we could have done anything. You know, we were invincible, you know. And that's the kind of state of mind I like to remind myself every time I go to another AA meeting. A sense of renewal sweeps over me. Possibilities in my life emerge. And I feel whole and happy and connected. Soon to be chewed up by life again. I haven't been given permanent remission from my neuroses. But I get whatever remissions I get are always gotten in the context of Alcoholics Anonymous and the principles that we'll go over here in the big book. I love it. It's like taking a shower every day. You know, I take showers every day. I wash my hair every day. I never had a place to go for emotional hygiene. You know, I just carried my own contamination into the next day and the day after and the day after that. And just like physical hygiene, it was additive. You know, I smelled psychically more tomorrow and the day after and the day after that than if I don't go to meetings. And those are some of the principles, I think, that we all learn when we tell our own story in the meetings. And in AA Comes of Age, a plug for a little book too, in AA Comes of Age, Bill tells our collective history, our story, what it's like collectively. You know, we now can fill nice auditoriums at pretty colleges. We can fill sporting arenas. 42,000 of us convened in Montreal, 4th of July weekend in 1985. And we can forget where we came from. You know, that one time we met around a kitchen table of an alcoholic, I was going to say pediatrician, proctologist in Akron. And that's where it began for us in the real way on June 10th, 1935. So we've come a long way. I think individually we've come a long way, and certainly we've come a long way collectively. A word about a friend of mine calls my little story the alcoholic Flintstones, you know, because one way I can treasure my own life is reminding myself where I've been. And one way I think one way we can celebrate what we have here today collectively is to view what alcoholics used to be like and how they were treated. And history has not treated alcoholics very well, as not surprisingly. And we haven't treated ourselves very well either. I'm going to start off, Joe a little later will make some biblical acknowledgments of alcoholism. But the people who arrived in this country, the Pilgrims, had alcohol problems. You know, it's been said that the reason they got off at Pilgrim Rock was because they ran out of booze. You know, and the problems of running out of booze, I think we can all relate to. And you get off wherever you are, and they got off there. And had an alcohol problem has been with this country from colonial days. You know, it's nice to remember. I saw some figures on the per capita consumption of alcohol by those people. And it's really a lot. I don't remember the figures, but I mean, they really didn't have much time for other stuff. Whatever Pilgrims did, did. Anyway, alcoholics have always been problems to their neighbors, as you might remember, and baffled in just to encapsulate this. In 1785, Benjamin Rush, one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, wrote a medical paper. He was a physician, and he wrote a medical paper on the spiritual aspects of alcoholism, and he suggested some treatments for it. And he, in his paper, indicated that alcoholism was a disease and it was progressive. A lot of us, when I came into AA, I thought the AMA, the American Medical Association, made that decision in 1956. But actually, Benjamin Rush in 1785 wrote that that alcoholism was a disease and it was progressive, and the only treatment for it was abstinence. You know. Now, whatever happened to that information that was available? And somehow collectively we lost that information because nothing really happened for the alcoholic in those years. It wasn't until about 1840 that a collection of drunks at Chase Tavern in Baltimore gathered, 6 of them, as they did every night. They gathered, it was an April night, and they gathered, it was temperance causes were taking over the country at that time. People were caught up in temperance. Sometimes you have the feeling that temperance may be alive and well even today with, about drunken drivers and that kind of media blitz. But anyway, it was certainly alive and well in 1840. And these 6 drunks at Chase Taverns decided they'd send one of their number down to check out the temperance meeting. And he went. And he came back and reported it was terrific, and he thought they all should do it. And in that moment that alcohols jump up and do stuff, the 6 of them jumped up and did it and got sober. You know, the Washingtonians were to sweep through the country in the 1840s, 1850s. In 1 year, By the end of that year, not even, they were founded in April. By the end of that year in December, they had 1,000 members. Now, some of you may remember that for us, it took us from June of 1935 till the summer of 1938 to get 40 members. They got 1,000 in less than a year. On their second anniversary, the president of the country, Abraham Lincoln, spoke to them at their convention. You know, they had meetings all over the country. They were they became celebrated by the temperance cause, because before the Washingtonians, the only usefulness alcoholics had to society were to be pointed at. You know, if you don't stop drinking, or if you pick up a drink, that's what you're going to end up like. But now they had people recovered from alcoholism, and substantial numbers of them. The papers of the time reported that 100 to 600,000 recovered sots in the Washingtonians. That's a lot of people for a country of our size in 1840. You know, and who heard of the Washingtonians but people in Alcoholics Anonymous today who read AA Comes of Age? You know, they went to meetings. They had regular meetings. They told their stories. They identified. They were almost evangelical, because their goal was to bring another man to each meeting. So they would go into bars, if need be, to get your man and bring him to the meeting. So it's not surprising they had a growth experience. But they had a lot of things that we had. They had prayer. They even had an ancillary program for the wives called the Martha Washington Group. And anyway, they captured the imagination of the temperance movement and the press. They were celebrated by the press. Yet in 12 years they vanished, virtually vanished. One of the leaders in the temperance cause, Lyman Beecher, said after some years that the Washingtonians had lost their thunder. And one of the things they didn't have was a big book. Nobody ever set down a recipe book. And the other thing they didn't have was any kind of traditions. You know, they didn't have a statement of traditions where the first one was about staying together. So they became kind of different branches with different policies, different viewpoints, different statements, and a lot of them went public. And when they went public, they got drunk. And the press celebrated their drunkenness too. So what goes up can come down. That's the point. I think it's true for us individually. We all have heard of or know people who have been sober for a long period of time and lose it. Witness Ebby Thatcher, the man who brought with an enormous amount of passion the message to Bill, and yet was to lose it for a good deal of his adult life. You know? And that can happen to us collectively if we don't hold on to what our principles are. So anyway, in a short period of time, there were no more Washingtonians. And the temperance cause itself went on the descent. And around about the turn of this century, 1900s, another group came along, the Emmanuel Movement. That was a time in history when the power of science was fusing with the power of religion. Mary Baker Eddy was alive and well in Boston with Christian Science. William James came along with his books, The Variety of Religious Experience, his courses of lecture. Somehow, intuitively, a lot of people in this country and all over kind of sensed if we could get these two things working together, what man knew about science and what man knew about religion, if instead of fighting each other all the time, everybody fighting for the same alcoholic, you know, the doctors wanted him and so did the religious leaders, if they could somehow work together in a symbiotic relationship, what enormous power they would have for healing. And that's exactly was the purpose of the Emmanuel groups. It was founded by a man, Elwood Worcester, who was minister of the Episcopal Church, the Emmanuel Church in Boston. And he had studied abroad. He had studied psychology abroad. So he himself had an understanding of basic psychological principles at that time, and he married them to what he knew to be true in the power of religion, confession, conversion, relaxation, that kind of power that we can change our lives in a moment. In a spiritual moment, we can turn our lives around. So anyway, he started this clinic for people with nervous disorders. So, most of them, I guess, were alcoholics, or a good deal of them were. And lo and behold, people got very sober in these Emmanuel movement clinics. And at one time, there were 4,000 to 5,000 recovered nervous disorder people in the Emmanuel groups. And they also had they had a man recover in the thing called Courtney Baylor, and he became the first alcoholic paid counselor. He was an alcoholic, and his job was to help other alcoholics. So you can see that collectively we were beginning to get a lot of stuff that exists in our program. And yet, who ever heard of the Emmanuel groups now? Because they didn't stay apart. They began to competition began between the medical profession and the religious people. Quarrels that developed publicly, where they would both make statements about the other people. The physicians wanted to treat the alcoholics and other people with nervous disorders, and the religious people wanted them. So there was that kind of competitiveness. And you can see where our traditions are coming into play here, that we stay out of those kinds of things. A little closer to our own time, the Oxford groups came along. A man called Frank Bookman. He was a Lutheran minister. He was from Allentown, Pennsylvania. And he apparently was an enormously charismatic man. At one time, in Hartford Seminary, about 40% of the people there were people whose lives were influenced by Frank Bookman. And he started this thing. He had his own religious conversion experience. He had, as I say, he grew up a minister. He was Pennsylvania Dutch, a Lutheran. But he had an incredible mission to the underclass initially. He opened a hostel for disadvantaged children. And he began to have a problem with the Board of Trustees. And he quit in a huff. He denounced them and he walked out. And he went to England, and he was in a church hearing a minister give a sermon, and he had a religious experience. He felt bad about treating the trustees like that. So he wrote letters of amends. And then he was to devote his whole life from thereafter, to basic, at those times, Christian principles. And he started something that was to be called the Oxford groups. He had an incredible influence with university people. He went to Princeton and got the local bootlegger sober. Bill Pickle was the guy's name. And Bill Pickle devoted his life to this movement. And anyway, this thing began to build the Oxford groups. They got their name. They were an unnamed group in the beginning. They considered themselves just an early Christian fellowship. But they were on their way to South Africa to help clear up some of the racial tension down there. This is 1928. And on their train throughout Africa, the porter put a sign up called the Oxford Group so that they could all sit together. And the press that was covering their mission to South Africa began to call them in the newspapers the Oxford Group. And the name stuck. And this was to sweep through the world, the Oxford Groups. At one time, they filled Madison Square Garden, 14,000 people. They were to fill the Hollywood Bowl with 35,000 people, and another 10,000 stood outside. Who ever heard of the Oxford groups today except people in Alcoholics Anonymous? I'm just saying there are lessons here for us. We can't make assumptions, I think. I can't assume that because I'm sober today, personally, that I'm always going to be sober. And I think that's true for us collectively. We should not make assumptions that unless we're vigilant and look after what we're doing and have a responsibility to get into our traditions and fight for them. It's embarrassing to fight for our traditions because we don't want to quarrel. We don't want dissension. But I think we have to look at the fact that history doesn't speak very well to people who don't fight for their principles and adhere to them. The Big Book Study Group is about going back and reaffirming where we've individually come from, our personal recovery. And I think these traditions are about us collectively going back into our history and getting a sense where we're collectively from. We need both. I need my individual recovery or I don't go anywhere. I don't get out of the house. But I also need the AA unity because it doesn't seem that I can do it by myself. If you're like me, the experience of the collective, going through the Big Book collectively is enormously more powerful than when I go through it myself. I'm just able to own things in an emotional way that I just can't do by myself. It's a collective prayer. It's concentration. Whenever we do things together, it's got enormous power. You know, when I'm by myself, I often fall asleep trying to read the Big Book. You know, but I don't fall asleep when we do it collectively. Even if I'm tired, somehow energy comes and an understanding comes that I can't have by myself. And those are the issues, I think, that history can help us get clear on. You know, that we all have a responsibility for ourselves, and we all have a responsibility for each other, whether we like it or not. You know, my well-being is contingent on your well-being. If you can celebrate your life, I can celebrate mine. I don't have much to celebrate if I'm not in tune with yours. Anyway, a lot of alcoholics got sober in the Oxford groups. A man called Roland Hazard. He was a student, a patient of Dr. Carl Jung's and kept getting drunk, the prominent Swiss psychiatrist. And he had still another trip over to Zurich to see Jung. And he asked Jung, he said, I keep getting drunk, and I've had my depth analysis. Is there anything else you can do for me? And Jung says, I've never seen an alcoholic of your kind recover without a spiritual conversion. And Jung pointed Roland in the direction of the Oxford groups. And Roland came back to New York and he started to go to the Calvary Church, where Sam Shoemaker was the New York titular head of the Oxford movement. And lo and behold, Roland got sober. Roland and some others carried the message to Ebby Thatcher, and Roland and Ebby Thatcher carried the message to Bill. And Bill needed a message, because Bill had had 4 trips to Towns Hospital, and he had been declared a hopeless drunk by Dr. Silkworth. You know, Silkworth told Lois that he would die drunk or crazy, you know, that he was hopeless. But somehow, through his alcoholic fog, Bill was able to hear Ebby's passion. And on his last trip to Towns Hospital on December 10th, 1934, he had his last drink. He got out of Towns and tried to help a lot of alcoholics, you know, and apparently to no avail. And he had a trip to Akron. He finally landed a job. As you know, Bill hadn't worked for 5 years before he found Ebby. I always like that, to remind some newcomers that our founder hadn't worked for 5 years by the time he got sober. And he wasn't really to work much after, in a classical sense, you know, for American industry. But he did get a temporary assignment to go over to a proxy battle fight. All of you know this story, so I'll encapsulate a little bit, to Akron for the National Machine Company. And he thought if he won the proxy battle, he would become president of the company. So he had incentive there. You know, somebody hadn't worked for 5 years. And he stayed at the Mayflower Hotel. He had $10 in his pocket, and he didn't win the proxy fight. And as you know, he heard the bar down the end of the hall. But he also noticed that they had a church directory. And now he had been sober 6 months with the Oxford groups in New York, and he knew he would benefit from the kinds of things I just talked about, that if he got together with other alcoholics, he would have power that isn't available to himself independently. And so he sought out another alcoholic. And he chose the name Walter Tunks from the church directory, which to Tunks happened to be involved with the Oxford groups and gave him a list of people, one of whom knew Henrietta Seiberling. And when Bill called Henrietta and said he was a rum bum from New York, Henrietta said, "You're the answer to my prayers, because I have a drunken doctor on my hands for 2 years here, and we haven't been able to help him." And independently, Dr. Bob Smith had gotten sober, or tried to get sober, in the Oxford groups in Akron. A man called Harvey Firestone had a son, Russell Firestone. And Russell was the town drunk in Akron. A very wealthy family, the Firestone tire people, and he was the town drunk in Akron. And lo and behold, Russell got mixed up with the Oxford groups, and Russell got sober. And as an enormous celebration of that fact, Harvey Firestone invited 60 people of the Oxford groups out to Akron for a blitz. He was going to save all of Akron. If you can save Russell, you can save anybody. And they were going to do a blitz of Akron for 10 days, and Dr. Bob got mixed up with that blitz. And that was in January of 1933. So some years later, in June of 1935, he still hadn't gotten sober, Dr. Bob, although he went to lots of these prayer meetings. But anyway, on Mother's Day 1935, he met the man from New York, Bill W., and he got sober. He was only going to stay 5 minutes, and he stayed 6 hours and got sober. And was to stay sober until June, when he went to a medical convention trip in Atlantic City. I won't ask for a show of hands of how many of us were drunk in Atlantic City, but Dr. Bob was one of us. Yeah. And anyway, he came back from that trip, and on June 10th he had his last beer, and he had an operation that morning. That's why Bill gave him his beer, to kind of steady his nerves. And so began Alcoholics Anonymous. Nobody knew it at that time. Bill was to stay with Dr. Bob. I like to remind myself this. Bill was to stay with Dr. Bob in Akron for almost 3 months. How many of us stay with a newcomer for that length of time? Almost nobody I can think of. But I mean, they had a passion and a zeal and a sense of needing each other that is nice to remind ourselves of. Anyway, they bubbled along. As you know, in that time, in those 3 months, they only got one other person sober. And that was a lawyer, Bill D., and he came out of Akron, Akron City Hospital. And Bill came back to New York and started working with drunks in New York. And Dr. Bob and Bill D. started really going to town in Akron. In about 1938, in the summer of 1938, there were 40 alcoholics sober, as I said. And 18 of them got together in a trip that Bill went out to. And part of the proposal was, we have some magic here with 40 of us sober. How can we define this magic and somehow codify our experience? And Bill had a proposal. He had 3 proposals. He wanted to do a big book to summarize the experience of the first people that got sober, and he also wanted paid counselors. As you know, they were hungry for jobs, and they thought they could all get work. And the third thing he wanted was a chain of hospitals. They wanted to control this thing. Well, the 18 of them voted no for the hospitals, no for the paid counselors, but they voted by one vote for the book. And but they gave them no money. They said, you go back and tell your fancy friends in New York that they should get the money together. So Bill came back and he got a list of 200 people, 200 of the richest people, and tried to hit them up for money, and they got nobody. You know, people thought, well, you're sober now, why don't you help yourself? And as you know, they begged, borrowed, and stole enough money to get the first printing done, and that was done in April of 1939. And they thought they had enough, just under 5,000 printed. I think it was 4,700 were printed. but they really thought they would sell from 100 to 600,000 books. Well, it took 2.5 years to sell the 5,000. So as a money raiser, it was a big disappointment. It took, by the way, 35 years to sell 1 million copies. We now sell over 1 million copies just in the United States per year. And it's in 15 other languages. You know, so it's come a long way. And I'm going to ask Travers to pick it up from there.
Thank you very much indeed, Frank. I'm an alcoholic and my name is Travers. And I would like to thank the committee and particularly Charlie and Joe for asking me to participate tonight. I've come from England, so any of the comments I may make about the things I'm going to talk about, the preface, the foreword to the first edition, the second edition, the third edition, may be coloured a little by my experience of trying to get recovery in that country and having found it, holding on to it. Regarding what Frank has just said, I would agree with so much that he's said. I think most countries have had the experience of organizations coming into being to help alcoholics and other things as well. We had one in England which grew from 1916 until in the 40s it numbered over 300,000 people. It was called TOC-H, and today it doesn't exist at all. And the reason being was, one of the main reasons was that the man who founded it was a clergyman and a very wonderful man. But he held on to the reins until he was 96 years of age. Now, I don't hold that against the man. I think he did not have our experience. A lot of experience can come to us out of America, and America's probably got something to learn. I note that it doesn't seem all that long ago, and certainly in my lifetime, when there was a lot of alcoholism, sometimes identified by drunkenness, that you decided to have prohibition as being a way of doing something about it through legislation. And you didn't have a great deal of success with that. And that is where I think experience, recorded experience, is always useful. Because if anybody worldwide today talks about legislation, prohibition for alcohol control, they refer to America. I think they're barking up the wrong tree. Because it may surprise you to know that China has had prohibition 194 times and unhad it 194 times. Which only goes to prove that some people don't learn by experience. Primarily, I'm here to introduce the opening pages of the big book. On the flyleaf of my big book, inside it says Alcoholics Anonymous. On a personal note, just above it, dated 86, it says, "Dear Travers, good luck. I hope that we meet afterwards. Frank M." If you turn over that flyleaf, you move on to the lists of other books in my edition, and then we come to what I call the front piece. And I think this is very important for me, coming from England. And it says at the top of the page, Alcoholics Anonymous. The story of how many thousands of men and women have recovered from alcoholism. We're very shy in England of using the term recovered. And I think that shows the lack of depth of our comprehension and understanding of the big book, Alcoholics Anonymous. Maybe we don't want to be quite perfect yet. Maybe we want to have a little license in case things don't work out too well. And then we can come back and say, well, I'm only recovering. But I have found great strength to know how many thousands of men and women have recovered from alcoholism. There's an interesting thing on the other page, too, and I address myself to many people who read avidly the stories of the big book, Alcoholics Anonymous, whatever edition they happen to be using, and deep down inside that little spark which says, I'd love my story to be in there. Interesting to note that 12 of the stories were not written for the big book, Alcoholics Anonymous. They were, in fact, written for Grapevine. So what I'm just putting in a plug here is get some material into Grapevine and maybe you'll find yourself in the book. And now we're going to dodge around for a little while the contents and the forewords and the preface. And being alcoholic and having a comprehension of what is right always, we will start on Roman numerals, page 15, forward to the second edition. Figures given in this forward describe the fellowship as it was in 1955. Since the original forward to this book was written in 1939, a wholesale miracle has taken place. Our earliest printing voiced the hope that every alcoholic who journeys will find the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous at his destination. Already, continues the text, 2s and 3s and 5s of us have sprung up in other communities. Many of us know who are fortunate enough to travel. There is hardly an area or a corner of this world you cannot go today where for you, at the end of your journey, will be available the strength of an AA meeting and group. 16 years have elapsed since our first printing of this book and the presentation in 1955 of our second edition. In that brief space, Alcoholics Anonymous has mushroomed into nearly 6,000 groups whose membership is far above 150,000 recovered alcoholics. Groups are to be found in each of the United States and all over the provinces of Canada. AA has flourishing communities in the British Isles, the Scandinavian countries, South Africa, South America, Mexico, Alaska, Australia, and Hawaii. All told, promising beginnings have been made in some 50 foreign countries and U.S. possessions. Some are just now taking shape in Asia. Many of our friends encourage us by saying that this is only a beginning, only the augury of a much larger future ahead. The spark that was to flare in the first AA group was struck at Akron, Ohio in June 1935 during a talk between a New York stockbroker and an Akron physician. 6 months earlier, the broker had been relieved of his drink obsession by a sudden spiritual experience following a meeting with an alcoholic friend who had been in contact with the Oxford groups of that day. And Frank has dealt, I think, very fully with the Oxford groups. He had been greatly helped by the late Dr. William D. Silkworth, a New York specialist in alcoholism who is now accounted no less than a medical saint by AA members, and whose story of the early days of our society appears in the next pages. And it is Dr. Silkworth's account of the start of AA that Charlie and Joe will be dealing with at length when this session is over. From this doctor, the broker had learned the grave nature of alcoholism. Though he could not accept all the tenets of the Oxford groups, he was convinced of the need for moral inventory, confession of personal defects, restitution to those harmed, helpfulness to others, and the necessity of belief in and dependence upon God. Prior to his journey to Akron, the broker had worked hard with many alcoholics on the theory that only an alcoholic could help an alcoholic, but he had succeeded in only keeping himself sober. The broker had gone to Akron on a business venture which had collapsed, leaving him greatly in fear that he might start drinking again. he suddenly realized that in order to save himself, he must carry his message to another alcoholic. That alcoholic turned out to be the Akron physician. Many of us here tonight know that desperate need to work with another alcoholic. This physician, the Akron doctor, had repeatedly tried spiritual means to resolve his alcoholic dilemma, but had failed. But when the broker gave him Dr. Silkworth's description of alcoholism and its hopelessness, the physician began to pursue the spiritual remedy for his malady with a willingness he had never before been able to muster. He sobered, never to drink again up to the moment of his death in 1950. This seemed to prove that one alcoholic could affect another as no non-alcoholic could. It also indicated that strenuous work, one alcoholic with another, was vital to permanent recovery. And that, I think, probably in that last sentence will tell you why there is such a large fallout in our fellowship worldwide. And it is that people have forgotten that very important first lesson, that strenuous work, one alcoholic with another, was vital to permanent recovery. Hence the two men set to work almost frantically upon alcoholics arriving in the ward of the Akron City Hospital. Their very first case, a desperate one, recovered immediately and became AA number 3. He never had another drink. This work at Akron continued throughout the summer of 1935. There were many failures, but there was an occasional heartening success. When the broker returned to New York in the fall of 1935, the first AA group had actually been formed, though no one realized it at the time. The reason, particularly, that no one realized it at the time was because the name or the phrase Alcoholics Anonymous had not then come into being. By late 1937, the number of members having substantial sobriety time behind them was sufficient to convince the membership that a new light had entered the dark world of the alcoholic. And in a small way today, that is being repeated everywhere. When, for whatever reason, a new group starts up, and it may go through a difficult patch at the very, very beginning, and then maybe after a year, 18 months, cohesion begins to come, and the solid, hardcore membership that each group must have, it is survived, is to be seen. And what a wonderful feeling when you are a member of one of those kind of groups. You actually see it coming together. And that's what they must have felt even then. A second small group had taken shape at New York, and besides, there were scattered alcoholics who had picked up the basic ideas in Akron and New York and were trying to form AA groups in other cities. It was now time the struggling groups thought to place their message and unique experience before the world. This determination bore fruit in the spring of 1939 by the publication of this volume. The membership had then reached about 100 men and women. I believe there's a little doubt as to the authenticity of that 100. Maybe it was a little closer to 75 or 80, but Bill was not too careful about stretching a point always. Maybe, 75, 74, 78. 100 is a good round alcoholic figure. The fledgling society, and that word there is, to me, is such a wonderful word. The society, and Bill used to call it the Society of Alcoholics Anonymous. The fledgling society, which had been nameless, now began to be called Alcoholics Anonymous from the title of its own book. The flying blind period ended, and AA entered a new phase of its pioneering time. With the appearance of the new book, a great deal began to happen. Dr. Harry Emerson Fosdick, the noted clergyman, reviewed it with approval. In the fall of 1939, Fulton Ausler, then editor of Liberty, printed a piece in his magazine called Alcoholics and God. This brought a rush of 800 frantic inquiries into the little New York office, which meanwhile had been established. Each inquiry was painstakingly answered. Pamphlets and books were sent out. Now that, again, is a great lesson to us. Way back then in 1939, the level of responsibility by that little band of people in that little office in New York, each inquiry was painstakingly answered. And that suggests to me that one word which appears later after the 9th step, the taking of pain, that there was a great deal of pain endured by those members from the sheer weight and effort they put in to make sure that no letters went unanswered, no call remained unanswered. Businessmen traveling out of existing groups were referred to these prospective newcomers. New groups started up, and it was found, to the astonishment of everyone, that AA's message could be transmitted in the mail as well as by word of mouth. By the end of 1939, it was estimated that 800 alcoholics were on their way to recovery. In the spring of 1940, John D. Rockefeller Jr. gave a dinner for many of his friends, to which he invited the AA members to tell their stories. News of this got on the world wires. Inquiries poured in again, and many people went to the bookstores to get the book Alcoholics Anonymous. By March 41, the membership had shot up to 2,000. Then Jack Alexander wrote a feature article in the Saturday Evening Post and placed such a compelling picture of AA before the general public that alcoholics in need of help really deluged us. By the close of 41, AA numbered 8,000 members. The mushrooming process was in full swing, and AA had become a national institution. And I think it's very important to note once again that any form of encouragement upon the public to take AA to its heart is always best left in the hands of the non-alcoholic. And I think that is very important for me always to remember. And once again, this word, our society, then entered a fearsome and exciting adolescent period. The test that it faced was this: could these large numbers of erstwhile erratic alcoholics successfully meet and work together? Would there be quarrels over membership, leadership, and money? Would there be strivings for power and prestige? Would there be schisms which would split AA apart? Soon AA was beset by these very problems on every side and in every group. But out of this frightening and at first disrupting experience, the conviction grew that AAs had to hang together or die separately. We had to unify our fellowship or pass off the scene. As we discovered the principles by which the individual alcoholic could live, so we had to evolve principles by which AA groups and AA as a whole could survive and function effectively. It was thought that no alcoholic man or woman could be excluded from our society, that our leaders might serve but never govern, that each group was to be autonomous and there was to be no professional class of therapy. There would be no fees or dues. Our expenses were to be met by our own voluntary contributions. There was to be the least possible organization, even in our service centers. Our public relations were to be based upon attraction rather than promotion. It was decided that all members ought to be anonymous at the level of press, radio, TV, and films. And in no circumstances should we give endorsements, make alliances, or enter public controversies. That was the substance of AA's 12 traditions, which was stated in full on page 564 of this book. Though none of these principles had the force of rules or laws, they had become so widely accepted by 1950 that they were confirmed by our first general international conference held in Cleveland. Today, the remarkable unity of AA is one of the greatest assets that our society has. While the internal difficulties of our adolescent period were being ironed out, public acceptance of AA grew by leaps and bounds. We were not overexposed at that time in the public media. And I believe the very fact that that lack of overexposure to the public media attracted and brought people forward to find out more about us. For this, there was two principal reasons: the large number of recoveries and reunited homes. These made their impressions everywhere. Of alcoholics who came to AA and really tried, 50% got sober at once and remained that way. 25% sobered up after some relapses, and among the remainder, those who stayed on with AA showed improvement. Other thousands came to a few AA meetings and at first decided they didn't want the program, but great numbers of these, about 2 of 3, began to return as time passed. And I think that's a great indication in our book about how well motivated people have to be in order to accept the tenets of Alcoholics Anonymous. Another reason for the wide acceptance of AA was the ministration of friends. Friends in medicine, religion, and the press, together with innumerable others who became our able and persistent advocates. Without such support, AA could have made only the slowest progress. Some of the recommendations of AA's early medical and religious friends will be found further on in this book. Alcoholics Anonymous is not a religious organization. Neither does AA take any particular medical point of view, though we cooperate widely with the men of medicine as well as the men of religion. Alcohol being no respecter of persons, we're an accurate cross-section of America, and in distant lands, the same democratic evening up process is now going on. By personal religious affiliation, we include Catholics, Protestants, Jews, Hindus, and a sprinkling of Muslims and Buddhists. More than 15% of us are women. Things change. At present, our membership is increasing at the rate of 7% a year, and that no longer holds good. So far upon the total problem of several million actual and potential alcoholics in the world, we have made only a scratch. In all probability, we shall never be able to touch more than a fair fraction of the alcohol problem in all its ramifications. And I think that sentence is so important today, and I think we have lost sight of it because at times I believe we overstretch ourselves in trying to create miracles and attain the impossible. In all probability, we shall never be able to touch more than a fair fraction of the alcohol problem in all its ramifications. Upon therapy for the alcoholic himself, we surely have no monopoly. Yet it is our great hope that all those who have as yet found no answer may begin to find one in the pages of this book and will presently join us on the high road to a new freedom. Now, if you'll turn to your table of contents, we'll deal with that just for a couple of moments. And Charlie's going to show you something on the screen. I am dealing with the preface and the foreword. And now we come to looking at 3 real areas. And the first of these areas we'll be examining, or Charlie and Joe will be examining for you, is to establish quite clearly for ourselves the problem and what it is. And that will be found in the doctor's opinion and in Chapter 1, Bill's story. The second thing the study group will be establishing is the solution to that problem. And the solution to that problem will be found in Chapters 2, 3, and 4. There is a solution, more about alcoholism and we agnostics. And finally, action necessary for recovery. That will be found in Chapter 5, how it works, Chapter 6, into action, and Chapter 7, working with others. And now we come to the... Yep, I'm sorry, Joe.
No, I can do it.
Go ahead.
Okay, so we won't do it later on. Now this sentence is very simple. First, we're going to establish what is the problem. Secondly, what is the solution. Thirdly, and the main thing is, what is the plan of recovery? Stepwise, we'll be looking at what is the problem. Step one is a problem statement. We're powerless over alcohol and our lives have become unmanageable. So the problem is powerless. Step two will be the solution. And actually we arrive at the solution by understanding the problem. If the problem is powerless, then the solution would be power. And since we don't know anything about the allergy, that power would have to work in the mind. Therefore, we believe the solution is power working in the mind. Came to believe that a power greater than ourselves can restore us to sanity. So the problem is powerless. The solution is power. And then that leads us to the main job then is, how do we find the power? And we have steps 3 through 12, which is a planned program of action which, if taken, will enable us to find the power in the second step that will solve the problem in the first step. So we're going to go through 3 things: powerless, power, how do we find that power?
Thank you. And now I'm just going to deal very briefly with the preface to the 3rd edition. This is the 3rd edition of the book Alcoholics Anonymous. The first edition appeared in April 1939, and in the following 16 years, more than 300,000 copies went into circulation. The second edition, published in 1955, reached a total of more than 1,150,000 copies. Because this book has become the basic text for our society, and I think that is probably the most important sentence in the whole of this book, and for us to carry that message out of here, because this book has become the basic text for our society, it has become accepted as a textbook and has helped such large numbers of alcoholic men and women to recover. There exists a sentiment against any radical change being made in it. Therefore, the first portion of this volume describing the AA recovery program has been left untouched in the course of revisions made for both the 2nd and 3rd editions. The section called The Doctor's Opinion has been kept intact, just as it was originally written in 1939 by the late Dr. William D. Silkworth, our society's great medical benefactor. The 2nd edition added the appendices, the 12 traditions, and the directions for getting in touch with AA. But the chief change was in the section of personal stories, which was expanded to reflect the fellowship's growth. Bill's story, Dr. Bob's nightmare, and one other personal history from the 1st edition was remained intact. 3 were edited, and one of these was retitled. New versions of 2 stories were written with new titles. 30 completely new stories were added, and the story section was divided into 3 parts under the same headings that are used now. In this 3rd edition, Pioneers of AA stands unchanged. 9 of the stories in Part 2, they stopped in time, are carried over from the 2nd edition. 8 new stories have been added. In Part 3, they nearly lost all. 8 stories have been retained. 5 are new. All changes made over the years in the Big Book, AA members' fond nickname for this volume, have had the same purpose: to represent the current membership of Alcoholics Anonymous more accurately and thereby to reach more alcoholics. If you have a drinking problem, we hope that you may pause in reading one of the 44 personal stories and think, yes, that happened to me. Or more important, yes, I felt like that. or most important, yes, I believe this program can work for me. Now I'd just like to read very simply the foreword to the first edition. We of Alcoholics Anonymous are more than 100 men and women who have recovered from a seemingly hopeless state of mind and body. To show other alcoholics precisely how we have recovered is the main purpose of this book. And I'm sure Charlie will be explaining to you later that precisely how we have recovered is in squiggly writing. For them, we hope these pages will prove so convincing that no further authentication will be necessary. We think this account of our experiences will help everyone to better understand the alcoholic. Many do not comprehend that the alcoholic is a very sick person. And besides, we are sure that our way of living has its advantages for all. It is important that we remain anonymous because we are too few at present to handle the overwhelming number of personal appeals which may result from this publication. Being mostly business or professional folk, we could not well carry on our occupations in such an event. We would like it understood that our alcoholic work is an avocation. When writing or speaking publicly about alcoholism, we urge each of our fellowship to omit his personal name, designating himself instead as a member of Alcoholics Anonymous. Very earnestly, we ask the press also to observe this request, for otherwise we shall be greatly handicapped. We are not an organization in the conventional sense of the word. There are no dues or fees whatsoever. The only requirement for membership is an honest desire to stop drinking. We are not allied with any particular faith, sect, denomination, nor do we oppose anyone. We simply wish to be helpful to those who are afflicted. And I think that little sentence says so much. We simply wish to be helpful to those who are afflicted. We shall be interested to hear from those who are getting results from this book, particularly from those who have commenced work with other alcoholics. We should like to be helpful in such cases. Inquiry by scientific, medical, and religious societies will be welcomed. And we finish, or I finish, on the foreword to the third edition. By March 1976, when this edition went to the printer, the total worldwide membership of Alcoholics Anonymous was conservatively estimated at more than 1 million, with almost 28,000 groups meeting in over 90 countries. Surveys of groups in the United States and Canada indicate that AA is reaching out not only to more and more people, but to a wider and wider range. Women now make up more than 1/4 of the membership. Among newer members, the proportion is nearly 1/3. 7% of the AAs surveyed are less than 30 years of age, among them many in their teens. The basic principles of the AA program, it appears, hold good for individuals with many different lifestyles, just as the program has brought recovery to those of many different nationalities. The 12 steps that summarize the program may be called one thing in one country and something else in another. I am language proof. But they trace exactly the same path to recovery that was blazed by the earliest members of Alcoholics Anonymous. In spite of the great increase in the size and span of this fellowship, at its core it remains simple and personal. Each day, somewhere in the world, recovery begins when one alcoholic talks with another alcoholic, sharing experience, strength, and hope.
Thank you, Travers. My name is Charlie Parman. I'm a very grateful recovering alcoholic. Because I'm a member of the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous, and by the grace of the power that I found in the 12-step program of Alcoholics Anonymous, haven't found necessary to take a drink for 6,981 days today, one day at a time, and for this I'm very grateful. And I'm so pleased to be able to be here tonight and set up here with Travers and with Frank. You know, usually Joe and I do this thing by ourselves, and we thought that we would be missing a wonderful opportunity if we didn't get Frank from Archives involved in the history of AA, and if we didn't get Travers involved, being from the United Kingdom, and being able to hear some of the ideas that he himself has brought to us from over there. And I think it's quite easy to see where most of our information comes from. People are always asking Joe and I, well, where did you read that? Or where did you find that out? Or I never knew that. And I think we can see tonight we're looking at basically here so far 2 books. AA Comes of Age and the big book Alcoholics Anonymous. And we find all the history of AA in those 2 books. And I think it's amazing to realize that most of it is in the front of the big book Alcoholics Anonymous. I read our book for years and never bothered to read the forwards, the preface, the first edition, and all that stuff. In fact, I really didn't want to read anything but the stories in the back of the book. And no wonder I knew nothing about the fellowship itself. And I think Frank is exactly right when he made the quote that said, if we forget where we come from, we may also forget where we're going. And I think the first part of the big book Alcoholics Anonymous is very, very important for us as AA members to know and understand where our fellowship did come from and what is actually going on about it. And the only way we're ever going to understand that is to read it, study it, and be willing to talk about it. And I think within those parts of the book that Travers has just read, we see certain points that are very important for us. Now, this fellowship did not have a name until the publication of the book in 1939. We were known by various different names. Some people called us the Drunk Squads of the Oxford Groups and various other different titles, but the Fellowship Alcoholics Anonymous really did not have a name until the big book Alcoholics Anonymous appeared in 1939. The fledgling society, the 40 men and women who had decided to write the book that had later turned to 100 by 1939, then began to call themselves Alcoholics Anonymous from the title of the book. And we know that within the book we have the story of how the first 100 men and women recovered from their disease of alcoholism. And surely as we looked at the foreword to the second edition, we could see that Bill had to know 3 things in order to recover. That Bill had to first know what the problem is. Like so many of we alcoholics, he thought it was willpower, moral character, sin, and various other things. Why should he not? He had been told that by many people. And it's only when he was treated by Dr. Silkworth and withdrawn from the disease or from alcohol that he learned the real problem, the disease of alcoholism, the physical allergy of the body and the obsession of the mind. It was only when Ebbe brought him the solution, the idea or the need for the vital spiritual experience that came from a psychiatrist on the other side of the world, through Roland H., through Ebbe to Bill, that Bill could begin to see the solution to the problem. He always thought it was willpower, like so many of us. And why would he not? That's what people kept telling him. Use your willpower and you'll be okay. It is only when Bill saw a practical program of action, these things referred to as the tenets of the Oxford groups, that Bill was able to apply that practical program of action in his life, and he was able to recover from the disease of alcoholism. I don't think it's by coincidence that Bill in Akron visited with Dr. Bob, not to get Dr. Bob sober, but to keep Bill himself sober. And to Bill's amazement, he found that Dr. Bob had been going to the Oxford groups. He had already been trying to solve his problem through spirituality, but he couldn't apply that in his life to the depth necessary to recover because Dr. Bob didn't know what was wrong with him. And Bill sits down with a well-trained surgeon. Now here's an old Colin manipulating, speculating, New York City stock manipulator. I think it's nice to call Bill a stockbroker. He was a real alcoholic just like all the rest of us. And he sits down with a well-trained surgeon and explains to the surgeon what's wrong with his mind and his body. I think that's the first miracle of Alcoholics Anonymous. Normally the surgeon would have said, who in the hell are you to be telling me what's... But Dr. Bob bought it, and when he bought into that information, then he also applied the practical program of action in his life. And he had a spiritual experience, and he recovered also. And then there came 40 of them. And they made a decision to take this information and put it down in a written form. And they put it down in what we know as the big book Alcoholics Anonymous. Now, when they took their name from the book in 1939, we could see then, in 1939, there were 2 Alcoholics Anonymouses. One, a book, which contained a program of recovery. That was the first Alcoholics Anonymous. Then a fellowship who had used that program to recover, and they became known as the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous. In 1939, the program in the book and the program in the fellowship were exactly the same. Now the book, as Travers read, has remained untouched through the process of the second edition and the third edition. The first 164 pages dealing with recovery has remained the same. So the program in the book is the same as it was in 1939. But you know, people change things. And most certainly the program in the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous, in many cases, in many instances, in many groups throughout the world, is a different program than the program in the book. You know, sometimes we go to an AA meeting today and we listen very, very carefully, and sometimes it's very difficult to determine what kind of fellowship we're in. Because in many cases we talk about everything except alcoholism and the recovery from alcoholism. Today we tend to talk about many other different things than those 2 basic items. And our hope through this weekend is, as we talk about the book, that we'll be able to kind of go back and look at the initial program and be able to see how these people did recover through that program. You see, they told Bill to write the book. But they said, Bill, this is not to be your book. They said this is to be the story of all 40 of us. And it's to be the collective knowledge, experience, and wisdom of all of us. And they said, Bill, as you write the book, we want to see the chapters. And we will add to, delete from, and we will change around. And when we're through, it will be the knowledge of all of us. And of course, by 1939, that number had become the 100 men and women. So hopefully this weekend, that mainly is what we're going to be talking about. Exactly how those people recovered. You know, it tells us that the main purpose of this book is to show others precisely how we have recovered. And I know today, and we all know up sitting at the table, there's only one requirement for membership in Alcoholics Anonymous, and that's a desire to stop drinking. Well, you can go to an AA meeting, you can stand up in the middle of the meeting and say, I don't like you people at all. Sure don't like your 12 steps and can just barely drink your lousy old coffee. And not a soul can say anything about that if you have a desire to stay sober. You are automatically a member of Alcoholics Anonymous. You know, you don't even have to be sober to be a member of AA. It helps if you are, but you really don't have to be a member of Alcoholics Anonymous. But our book, that we're going to look at it this weekend, really doesn't deal with fellowship. It deals with one thing and one thing only: recovery from the disease of alcoholism. And they have laid out for us a precise method of recovery. The same thing that they had to find out, the same things they had to do. The book is going to show us the problem, it's going to show us the solution, and it's going to show us a practical program of action. And if we follow that program of action, we're guaranteed that we will have a spiritual awakening, just like the first 100 did. And then we maybe can recover from the disease also. Now, before we start into this, Joe and I always like to say, and I'm sure the other two fellows agree also, we do not consider ourselves to be the experts on the big book Alcoholics Anonymous. We certainly do not consider ourselves to be the gurus of anything. We are just two old drunks that met together some years ago and found a mutual interest in the book, and we studied it together for a while, and hopefully we've learned an item or two that we love to share with other people. We most certainly do not speak for AA as a whole, and you are free to agree or disagree with anything we say as you see fit. In fact, if we say something that cannot be reconciled with what's in the big book, we would suggest you pay no attention to that whatsoever, because we're here to talk about the big book this weekend. Joe, let's have you introduce yourself if you want, and then we'll take a little break, and then we'll go into the doctor's opinion, okay?
Okay.
Go ahead.
My name is Joe, and I'm a real alcoholic. You ready to go?
You want to say anything before we do?
Huh?
You got anything you want to say before we do?
No, you ready to go? You want to take a break or go on?
We need to take a little break. I
Okay,
think.
let's take a break.
Why don't we take about a 10-minute break, and then we...
Okay, we're ready to get started. Everybody just move along. As we went through the table of contents, we laid out the plan of the book, and the foundation we're going to begin with the doctor's opinion is what is the problem. You know, we look at the simplicity of the big book, and it is laid out on a basic, simple plan of solving problems. It is a textbook, and a textbook is a book is written in a sequence of ideas to convey to the reader to arrive to a point. And we can see that it is the basic plan of solving any problem. It's not only, and this can be applied to, there are many, many problems, but solving problems is a simple process of solving problems. And the first step in solving a problem is to find out what is the problem. That information has to be gathered, regardless to what it is. That is the first thing we find out, what is the problem. And once we understand the problem, it is from that information that we determine the solution. So we have to have the problem in order to find the solution. And once we establish those 2 points, then we can lay out a planned program of action. We might say that this is what our textbook is going to do. It's going to show us the exact nature of the problem. And then it's going to show us the solution, and then it's going to lay out a way to go from a planned program of action that will carry us away from the problem to the solution. Now, as Frank said, in the history of the world, for many, many years, the reason alcoholics suffered, we didn't understand the problem. You know, as we look at the problem of alcoholism, or whatever, you know, it's been called many, many things down through history, as men begin to drink, and as the figures, they use different figures, but they used to, old figures of 1 out of 10. We'll stick with that. Of every 10 people to drink, as they begin to drink, one of them had a problem. Now, what happened? The people who didn't have a problem, the so-called normal drinkers, they were the ones that tried to find out what was wrong with the guy who was having the problem. See, all the attitudes and concepts of the alcoholic were developed.